That's that. So there we go. So good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for being here. My name is Francesca Sergini. I am a professor of English literature at the University della Tuscia in Viterbo, sunny Italy, although I hear from the chat that today is not so sunny. And currently I am a Marie Curie Fellow at the University of Edinburgh. So just to give a little bit of insight into what happened and why I decided to put this seminar together, we have to go back to the romantic disconnections, reconnections most of us must have participated in. So we're going back to August 2021, and amongst the various salons that were organized, I happened to attend one that was hosted by Sarah Badette, one of the speakers of today. And the salon was very, very successful and gave me a lot of food for thought. And I thought it would have been nice to follow it up with a seminar, a digital seminar that could move forward and give us an idea of the state of the field as well as a possible way forward. So the state of the field and the new way forwards seminar builds on the research and teaching experience of 5 speakers operating in 4 national contexts. So we're going to have a speaker from Ireland, a speaker from Italy, 2 speakers from the UK, and 1 speaker from the USA. And what we are attempting to do is to draw a tentative map of the evolving domain of theatre studies from a transdisciplinary and multinational perspectives. So each one of us will present their current research, and amongst the topics that we are going to discuss in the seminar, we're going to have the theatre and disability, theatre econometrics, theatre and celebrity, theatre and gender, and opening the Romantic Theatre Canon. Amongst the different issues, which include pedagogy, stage revival as well, we would like also to introduce the project which has been funded by the European Research Council, and that centers around David, and also a few words about my own project at the end of the presentation. So the first speaker of today is Sarah Badette, who is a social lecturer in English and Comparative Literary Studies at the University of Warwick. I have prepared a little bibliography for each speaker so that people who are attending today may have an updated idea of what the state of the field is. Sarah has been working at a monograph that is entitled The Arms-Bearing Woman and British Theatre in the Age of Revolution, which is currently in press with Belgrade Macmillan. But Sarah is also discussed issues such as gender transgression in performance, dramatic depictions of revolutionary violence, romantic melodrama, the Georgian actress, and so on. Some of her articles have appeared in comparative drama, restoration in 18th century theatre research, and sound, stage, and screen. The following speaker is going to be Helen Dallas, who is a DPhil candidate at the English faculty at the University of Oxford, and she is based at Trinity College. Her research focuses on dramatic character and how they were created, understood, and responded to across stage, and material culture. She's interested in plays read and performed in the Romantic period, and she's also interested in dramatic characters across media, including criticism, reviews, images, consumer products, celebrity biographies, actors' reflections, and the accounts of audience members. The third speaker of the day is Asaka Joshua, who's Associate Professor of English at the University of Notre Dame. Asaka's bibliography is quite substantial. You may have a look at it in the bottom part of the screen. However, today Professor Joshua is going to discuss theatre and disability. So she is going to discuss the following research questions. What does disability mean on stage at a time when there is no, sorry, I don't manage to see the whole screen. There's no idea of disability, I suppose. What are the words used for it, and what types of roles lend themselves to particular disabilities? We have a couple of covers for Asaka's works. And then we're going to move to Professor David O'Shaughnessy, who is Professor of 18th Century Studies at New University Galway. David has published widely on William Godwin and on 18th century theatre. And most recently, he's edited Ireland, Enlightenment, and the English Stage, and co-edited the Letters of Oliver Goldsmith. Many congratulations, because David has been recently awarded an ERC Consolidator grant on his project Theatronomics, and he's going to discuss this today. I have added the Cordis Europa EU address you may want to have a look at for updates about the projects as well. And Theatronomics investigates the finances of 18th century theatre in London, including the two Royal Theatres, Covent Garden and Drury Lane. And you have a couple of images for David's books, and also his Twitter account, The Business of Georgian Theatre, which you may want to have a look at for updates about his ERC-funded project. Finally, myself, I've already introduced myself. My current project is Opera New, Opening Romanticism, Reimagining Romantic Dramas for New audiences on Francis Burney's court dramas. And you may find a blog for myself on the University of Edinburgh website, and also a couple of covers for my own recent work in the field of romantic and 18th century romantic dramas. So thank you very much to all today's speakers. And now, without further ado, we move on to the first speaker of the day. Sarah, take the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will just pick my screen up. There we go. Okay. So this presentation I'm going to give today will summarise some of the key findings from my forthcoming monograph, which explores representations and receptions of the arms-bearing woman on London's and Dublin's patent stages from 1789 to 1815. Building on important studies of the cross-dressed female soldiers that amused and titillated audiences in comedies and farces of the period, my study foregrounds the arms-bearing woman whose troubling significance is less allayed by whimsical characterisation or humour. The figure of the tragic actress brandishing a dagger was by no means an unfamiliar sight on the long 18th associated with the tragic muse. What my study looks to reveal, however, are the radically revised political and ideological inferences attached to the stage Amazon on the British stage in the years encompassing the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. Magnifying heroines who appear on stage not only brandishing daggers, but also handling pistols, wielding swords, and even firing explosives, I show the female warrior to serve in the British theatre as a powerful allegorical tool, freighted with richly layered and often surprising allusions to figures of local, political, national, and international significance. A quick outline then of my key hypotheses. While studies of the female warrior upon the British Romantic stage are surprisingly limited, 18th century and Romantic literature scholars have sketched out general transformations in the figure's identity, which are shown to occur chronologically, collectively, and successively. By turning to the theatre, I'm able to extend and nuance this scholarship by showing the arms-bearing woman to embody a plurality of simultaneous meanings on account of the multiple and often discordant strands of influence that feed into her representation. Not denying outright, however, the formation of certain epochal trends, my study foregrounds two key factors that precipitate the armed woman's theatrical development across the period 1789 to 1815. These are evolving notions of national identity and new dramatic forms imported from Europe. Spotlighting the stage Amazon's intricate interventions in discourses pertaining to Anglo-French, Anglo-Irish, Anglo-German and Anglo-Spanish relations, I propose a degree of commensurability between the armed woman's theatrical reputation and Britain's perpetually shifting relationship with home and European nations. Furthermore, by juxtaposing representations of armed women offered in sentimental comedies and tragedies of the early and mid-1790s with representations projected in dramatic genres imported from Europe, notably the German Sturm und Drang and the French-derived melodrama, I make a case for identifying new dramatic forms as crucial in facilitating possibilities in the early 1800s for the emergence of a female warrior whose degree of agency, destructiveness, and heroism surpasses that of her tragic and sentimental predecessors. And I want to use the time remaining in this presentation to provide a brief snippet of the ways in which I illustrate these claims. So, in the period of the French Revolution, the armed or martial woman comes to stand in Britain as the representation of extreme political and social disruption. As reflected in the political cartoons displayed here by Thomas Rowlandson and Isaac Cruikshank, the figure embodies in striking form the revolutionary chaos witnessed across the Channel, which threatens to infect British culture. While the female warrior becomes synonymous on the one hand with dangerous revolutionary energy, however, in the British theatre, at different points across the revolutionary and Napoleonic campaigns, the figure's image is negotiated and reappropriated in ways that allow for often unexpected allegorical reconfigurations. Three moments crucial to the armed heroine's transformation on stage, which I've pinpointed here, are the Reign of Terror, the Act of Union of 1801, and the Peninsular Wars of 1808 to 1814. Interpreting armed heroines in the context of these events and their representations in British mass media, it becomes possible, remarkably, to interpret Sarah Siddons's rendition of Lady Macbeth, performed at Drury Lane in 1794, as an embodiment of the recently deceased Marie Antoinette, who serves to foster in British theatregoers support for the war against France. It becomes equally viable to read Matthew West's tragic dramatisation of Charlotte Corday's murder of French revolutionary leader Jean-Paul Marat, staged at the Crow Street Theatre in Dublin in 1803, as an anti-Union allegory, in which Corday symbolises the militarised Hibernia and Marat becomes the surprising representative of British rule. And it's additionally feasible to recognise Coleridge's Spanish sword-wielding woman, Alhadra, from his tragedy Remorse of 1813, as an image of the armed guerrilla maids, actively engaged in the war against Napoleon being fought in the peninsula. While these pivotal political and national developments therefore play an integral role in refashioning the stage Amazon's identity, so too does the emergence in Britain at the turn of the 19th century of the German Sturm und Drang drama and the French-derived melodrama. Recent scholarship has foregrounded the Europhobic criticisms directed against these illegitimate genres, which are accused of being aligned too closely with the monstrous tragic comic scenes witnessed across the Channel. The importance of these genres to my study derives from their ubiquitous depictions of arms-bearing heroines who are instrumental in expediting the stage Amazon's theatrical development. Among the chief causes of British discomfort with the German drama, my study proposes, is the presence of a sword-bearing heroine. As you can see from the preface to Richard Cumberland's adaptation of Kotzebue's Joanna, which I've quoted here on the screen, the sword-bearing heroine, whose military prowess paints her in the masculine image of the heroic war hero, poses a threat both to the supposedly inherent physical distinction between the sexes and to the superior femininity of the English actress over her unnaturally masculine German counterpart. The threat posed by the sword-bearing heroine was such that in his adaptation of Schiller's The Robbers, Joseph George Holman diverged from what Tytler's literal translation of the script in having his heroine, Eugenia, threaten her lover's brother, with a dagger, as opposed to the original sword. Despite efforts to keep the patent stage free of sword-bearing German heroines, in Coleridge's Remorse of 1813, also modelled on The Robbers, the sword-wielding female is resurrected in the form of Alhadra, who uses her murdered husband's weapon to assassinate the tyrannical Ordonio. If the German drama introduces the sword-bearing heroine to Britain's patent theatres, the melodrama goes one step further, introducing to the British stage an Amazon who achieves unsurpassable levels of destruction via the use of explosives. The conflagration scene was a popular melodramatic trope, exploited by dramatists aware of the emergent vogue for spectacular visual effects. An early example of such a scene occurs in Isaac Pocock's The Miller and His Men, performed at Covent Garden in 1813. In this play, Ravina secures her liberty from a band of banditti who have taken her hostage when blowing up the barn in which the banditti are based, thus positioning herself as the play's agent of mass destruction. 2 years later, in the melodrama Charles the Bold, the heroine Leontina, played by Fanny Kelly, murders the play's eponymous tyrant when blowing him up with a cannon. Here we have an example of an armed woman whose identity is facilitated by an amalgamation of both political and theatrical evolutions. Informed on the one hand by the new stage technologies for which melodrama was renowned, Leontina's identity bears striking allusion also to the Maid of Saragossa, heroine of the Peninsular Wars, who famously manned a cannon against French invaders in 1808, and that's her represented there in the image by David Wilkie. Both Ravina and Leontina represent military heroines whose use of firearms vitally enables the conventional melodramatic triumph of virtue over vice. And they are not anomalous in this respect, but are part of a theatrical trend that emerges in the 1810s in London's major and minor theatres. In William Barrymore's melodrama, The Blood Red Knight of 1810, we find Isabella shooting the play's villain with a pistol. And in H.W. Grossett's Raymond and Agnes, or The Bleeding Nun of 1811, Marguerite similarly rids the play of its villains using both a dagger and a gun. In the space covered then between 1789 and 1815, we see the armed woman transform from embodiment of vice to preserver of virtue. I want to close my presentation with a comment on authorship and gender. Of all the plays featured in my study, only one is by a female dramatist. This being Next Door Neighbours, the sentimental drama by playwright Elizabeth Inchbold. This was not a conscious choice, but a reflection of the fact that across 1789 to 1815, within serious plays intended for performance, female warriors are represented far more frequently by male than female dramatists. Scholars interrogating romantic writings on war have shown the female author who engages with military conflicts to transgress the gendered division of spheres by imaginatively abandoning the domestic space for that of the male domain of the battlefield. I want to argue that for the female dramatist writing of war, there is even more at stake. Enacting a dual form of transgression, she ventures into the male sphere not only imaginatively via her subject matter, but literally and physically too, via the communication of her material in the public space of the theatre. Given this degree of subversiveness, the fate of the theatrical female warrior is left largely in the hands of men, and the extent to which gendered authorship bears upon the ideological biases with which the figure is freighted is a preoccupation that remains at the forefront of my analyses across the course of my study. So, to conclude this whirlwind run-through of my monograph, for the examples glimpsed today, I hope to have gone some way towards presenting the British theatre of the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic periods as an arena in which the significance of the arms-bearing woman is constantly remodelled and reappropriated to fulfil diverse ideological functions. Used to challenge as well as to enforce established notions of sex and gender difference, she's fashioned also as an allegorical tool, serving both to condemn and to champion political and social rebellion at home and abroad. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah. That was good. And I love the final slide with the Castle Spectre. How can we not love it? Possibly my favorite romantic play ever. Right, thank you very much. Also, quite interested in the woman operating the cannon. That was a good one. I must remember it for family business. Anyway, we're moving on to the second speaker of today, who is going to be Helen. I hope she's here with us. So if you want to unmute and start your presentation with many thanks.
Hi, let me just get my PowerPoint up. Will it start? Can you see that?
I can. I hope everybody else does.
Okay, I'll trust you, Francesca. I'll trust you. Okay, so as you may have gleaned from Francesca's biographies and bibliographies, I'm much earlier in my career than the other speakers here. So I'm going to be doing a kind of overview of my PhD project, which is looking at character. So the working title at the moment is Making Dramatic Character, Theatre, Actors and Publics in the Romantic Period. And part of the rationale behind this project is that studies of character in the Romantic period have previously tended to focus on the novel, such as Deirdre Lynch's Economy of Character. There's a well-trodden literary historical narrative that it was theatre's inability to rival the novel in the creation of character that led to the touted decline of drama, as described in Laura Brown's English Dramatic Form and Rose Zimbardo's A Mirror to Nature. But looking at how people actually engaged with theatre and with dramatic characters in the Romantic period, the idea of a decline of drama doesn't really seem to be borne out. There has been important recent scholarship complicating the relationship between the novel and the theatre, including Ros Ballister's Fictions of Presence, Marcy Frank's The Novel Stage, and much of Francesca's own work. It's not my intention to retread this ground. Instead, I'm hoping to offer a theatrical counter-history of character, which attends to the Romantic period as a moment of media constellation, which saw dramatic character constructed through performance, closet drama, character criticism, periodical press, prints, portraits, and consumer products. I'm really sorry if there's a lot of background noise right now. I live in the main road and it is rush hour. So my thesis is structured around 4 broad ways in which character was made along these lines. So my first chapter looks at character criticism, an essay form that emerged in the latter half of the 18th century, in which the writer closely analyses a character or characters from Shakespeare's plays. Shown on this slide are 4 title pages for such works, but there are many, many more examples. I think it's significant that it is in response to drama, not the novel, that this analysis of character emerges. Indeed, in Thomas Whatley's remarks on some of the characters of Shakespeare, published posthumously in 1785, probably written around 1769, Whatley writes that characters can never be perfectly exhibited except in a drama. One intention in this chapter, then, is to emphasize the period's interest in specifically dramatic character. Another is to recuperate character criticism as theory. Drawing on recent work by Rita Felsky, Amanda Anderson, and Toril Moy, I propose that we can tease out from character criticism a theoretical framework of attachment that reveals not only that character was engaged with, but was created through this attentive analysis. The second chapter digs into the embodiment of dramatic character in the period. Jumping off Charles Lamb's famous claim that it is difficult for a frequent playgoer to disembarrass the idea of Hamlet from the person and voice of Mr. K, we speak of Lady Macbeth while we are in reality thinking of Mrs. S, Campbell and Siddons, obviously. This chapter explores the ways in which the complex and contested relationships between actor and character were staged, explored, and played with by playwrights, portrait artists, caricaturists, and even audience members in their accounts of performance. A part of what I'm trying to do with this chapter is to counter the way that celebrity studies has tended to approach character when looking at the careers of star performers. Character has often been treated as a kind of tool of an actor's fame, a way of staging their celebrity. But characters are complex constructions of text, embodied performance, and audience reception, worthy of analysis on their own terms. And what's more, Romantic period popular culture saw them that way. In this chapter, I track across a range of sources, which include textual accounts of performance, portraits, satirical prints, and Marie de Camp's wonderful afterpiece, Personation or Fairly Taken In, all of which in various ways explore the role of the body and indeed often the audience in creating character. In this chapter, I'm really thinking about the necessity of the body for dramatic character, which I then challenge in the next chapter. This is a little less developed because I haven't started on it yet, but I want to think about reading closet drama as another interaction with dramatic character that is, firstly, specifically and significantly dramatic, rather than something that's moving towards the novel or poetry as a form, and relatedly, which actively encourages the imagination of the body's presence. I'll be drawing here on Catherine Burrow's work on closet drama, digging into what Byron called mental theatre, what Joseph Donohue's talked about as the theatre of the mind or the theatre of the imagination. As Judith Pascoe suggests in the Sarah Siddons audio files, the ability to imagine a performance can involve a very close connection to performance. For example, this is a quote from Pascoe, when Thomas Cedric Whalley sent Anna Seward a copy of The Castle of Montval in advance of the play's staging at Drury Lane in 1799, he insisted that she read one part of it as if it was spoken by Sarah Siddons, as written for her manner of speaking and for hers alone, end quote. Wally anticipated that Seward would be able to imagine Siddon speaking without her present performing. I want to test out how this kind of theatre of the imagination might sit with closet drama. My hypothesis is that closet drama doesn't align with Catherine Gallagher's description of the novel as a way of dispensing with the body to facilitate the appropriation of characters' emotions by a reader, but rather is really invested in embodiment, even when the embodiment is entirely imagined, not actually corporeal. Mental theatre is, I think, still in a form theatre. And my final chapter is ambitiously trying to offer something a little hopeful for us theatre researchers who are always aware that we can't see what we're writing about. We're having to piece it together and imagine it from archival evidence, which is in itself an interesting parallel to what I've said just now about mental theatre. I'm looking at how people in the Romantic period might have interacted with characters beyond page and stage, including people who'd never seen actors and the characters depicted. I'm interested in things like these figurines of Kitty Clive as Mrs. Riot and Henry Woodward as the fine gentleman from David Garrick's play Lethe. Firstly, what these objects reveal about people's relationship to dramatic characters. And it absolutely fascinates me that these are the two characters in Lethe who mention going to the theatre. Lisa Freeman, who's using Catherine Gallagher's work I mentioned earlier, writes that in the 18th century, the theatre resisted the forms of appropriation available to readers of novels precisely because the bodies of the actors and actresses presented what Gallagher would term a proprietary barrier to the audience. And what I think something like these figurines shows is that the actor's body offered a different kind of proprietary relationship by providing a form that was mass marketable, both in the theatre and as merchandise, which people could and clearly wanted to own. And then the second interest here is what these objects might represent to someone who didn't attend the theatre. This is quite speculative, but throughout my thesis, I'm building a sense of how my sources across a wide range of media are attempting to preserve a particular iteration of character. I'm interested in how that preservation is itself a creation and how that becomes more and more potent the further we move away from the actual moment of performance. As an example of where this preservation or recreation of an actor's iteration of a character is made for an audience who wouldn't have actually seen it, here is Robert Dyton's 1794 print showing Stephen Campbell playing Hamlet in Edinburgh, a large manager in a great character, which is blatantly and disturbingly fatphobic. I've reproduced on the slide Shira West's comments about this print because I just think they're fascinating. She writes, although most Londoners had not seen the performance, they were happy to invest in the print, which amused through its juxtaposition of the noble character with a less than noble physiognomy. So for Dyton's original audience, there was a geographical distance that meant that they weren't seeing a representation of an actor in character that they had actually witnessed. And for us, that's a temporal distance. I think sources like this suggest that actually we might be able to capture some tiny aspect of how publics experience theatre in the Romantic period, because we can see that it moves beyond performance itself and permeates much wider aspects of culture for people who never made up a particular audience. And I think it captures how vital character was to that permeation as its vessel and its driving force. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Absolutely spot on. You also respected the time slots. Very interesting discussion. Also, I'm quite taken by the fact that you're working beyond the page and the stage. So I have a question that I would like to ask when we get to the end of the session. Right, we're going to move on to the third speaker now. I'm very glad to welcome Asaka, who's recently joined us. So, are you here, Asaka?
I am.
Hi,
yes.
hello. Very nice to see you. And you can take it away now. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm just going to start my video. Hello, I'm Asaka Joshua. I'm going to be talking today about disability in romantic theatre. I'm just going to share my screen with you. Let's see if we can do that. Hang on. 1 second. All right, let's see if we can get the presentation up. There we go. All right, is that visible? Yeah.
Yes, it is. It is for me
Great.
anyway. Thank
Thank
you.
you. And I'm just going to try and find the chat as well, because I've got an access copy that I want to give people who want to follow along. Okay, there we go. All right, so my opening slide, I'll go back to my opening slide, is a portrait of Marie-Thérèse de Camp in the role of Julio from Thomas Holcroft's play Deaf and Dumb. The label says Mrs. C. Campbell, which refers to her married name. She wears an empire line coat. One hand grasps a curl above her eyebrow, the other loosens her shirt collar neckline. Building on recent developments in literary disability studies and the particularly vibrant fields of early modern theatre disability studies, my next project is a study of romantic theatre and disability, focusing on drama in performance as well as text. Many overviews of the 19th century theatre now have the obligatory chapters on gender, race, sexuality, empire, and class. The category of disability, however, is often missing, and the significance of disability to all these categories has been underestimated. The important historical and theoretical work of the type that we've seen in relation to gender, race, sexuality, empire, and class is only beginning to emerge in relation to disability. This involves historicizing the concept of disability and its related terms, and using the tools of modern disability theory to shed light on historical texts. Disability studies is an interdisciplinary field that emerged in the 1990s, and the slide I've got here shows a montage of the front covers of the canonical books on disability studies theory. The field aims to reorientate the history, culture, and perception of people with disabilities in a wide range of disciplines in the arts, humanities, and social sciences. Disability studies invites us to rethink what we bring to all texts. Disability theory is a rich and diverse field, and there are many ways of conceptualizing disability. But the field continues the dynamic of inclusion raised by feminist and critical race theory that originates in the civil rights movements that in turn have their origins in Romantic era thought. My aim with this next project is to bring disability studies into conversation with Romantic theatre and drama studies. And my research questions are these. I want to ask, what cultural work does disability do in plays and in their performances? How are ideas about disability shaped by theatrical traditions and conventions? How do Romantic era audiences respond to disability? What are some of the requirements of actors' bodies and voices? What are some of the legacies of the plays? And what does a disability studies approach add to our understanding of them? My goals, or my intention, is to uncover the ways in which drama intervenes or is significant for history and the culture of disability, but also the ways in which disability shapes drama. These goals are interrelated, but have obviously a different emphasis. Firstly, I want to briefly examine the first question, or first goal. How does drama intervene in disability history? By this I mean, how does drama contribute to the wider history pertinent to disabled people? I mean the personal history, I mean experiences revealed in the lived experiences of disabled people connected with the theatre. I mean the history of institutions related to disabled people, such as asylums and schools and their engagement with drama. I mean the cultures associated with disability, such as accessibility and accommodation. It's also important to acknowledge that we don't yet have a history of disabled theatre going. And this is also going to be a history of disability and its related concepts, such as deformity, madness, and illness. I want to think about the way theatre contributes to the language around disability. For example, what does it mean to be indisposed or too ill to perform? And why did a medicalised and public certification of actors' indispositions come about? My second question, how does disability shape drama, is centred on the ways in which experiences of disability have contributed to the writing and performance of drama. Disabled roles, disabled actors, writers, audiences. I want to take as my brief example, and the time I have left with you, the text that, a text that engages with both of these questions, and it's Thomas Holcroft's Deaf and Dumb from 1801. This is an adaptation of Jean-Nicolas Bouilly's popular play L'Abbé de l'Épée from 1799. The play tells the story of the recovery of the identity of a young man who was a deaf aristocrat who has been abandoned by a family member. Helped by the Abbé, Theodore, as he becomes, he's originally called Giulio, finds his family and reclaims his inheritance. The chapter I'm working on approaches this text as an early melodrama. It was recognized as belonging to this genre during the period. Melodrama in particular is important as a genre for disability history rather, because it's a form of adaptive theatre. Melodrama emerged along with other genres in non-licensed theatres, which had restrictions on verbal communication. To provide narrative circumstances for non-verbal communication, melodrama invested heavily in disabled characters. The non-speaking role in non-licensed theatre was so important that it appears in many of the titles of the plays. The next slide shows an example of 26 19th century play titles with the word dumb in them, all centering on non-speaking parts. These roles had measures of excellence, propriety, and rules of taste, and it was possible to develop a reputation through such a part. And they were so important that they transferred to licensed theatres, as it did in the case of Deaf and Dumb, where there were no restrictions on speaking, but the characters were still silent. Holcroft's play Deaf and Dumb contains a major role for a non-speaking deaf character, Giulio. It opens at the Theatre Royal Drury Lane, one of the licensed theatres, on the 24th of February 1801, starring John Philip Kemble as the celebrated educator and founder of the deaf school in Paris, the Abbé de l'Épée, and Marie-Thérèse de Camp as Giulio. De Camp was known for her trouser roles, where she played men and boys in breeches, and trained as a mime with Joseph Grimaldi, the leading clown of the period, whose white face makeup is still used today. Holcroft's Deaf and Dumb draws important connections between sign language, melodramatic acting styles, and sensibility. It contrasts the facility, naturalness, and sincerity of bodily communication with the imprecision, obfuscation, and disfluency of oral speech. As is the case for much of melodrama, characters show their true feelings. Melodrama's non-verbal roles were part of a heightened interest in the expressive body and physiognomy that we see in romantic writing more widely. Deaf and Dumb is important for understanding how disability shapes drama because of the deaf non-speaking role. Non-speaking roles generate an adaptive form of theatre. The plots accommodate the non-speaker, and communication is central to the stories that are told. The play is important for disability history because it was the first time that a systematized sign language was approximated on the British stage. More than this, though, it was part of the international dissemination of an important story that was used to articulate the value of educating deaf people at a time when there were few established deaf schools in Europe and none in America. Deaf and Dumb was taken up by advocates for deaf education and was performed and circulated to fundraise for deaf institutions. There are examples of this happening in Birmingham and Edinburgh, for instance. The cultural impact of the play even extended to children's literature and its circulation through periodicals as well. The play's importance to disability history is also made apparent by the French deaf educator Laurent Clerc's publication of the first American edition. He published it to garner financial support for the first American deaf school in Hartford, Connecticut in 1818. Here's what Clerc says about the play. May the piece fall into the hands of the Americans. May it be read with attention, and may it make them feel the indispensable necessity of educating their poor deaf and dumb. And if all the deaf and dumb are educated, there will not be another Dalmont in the world. So my concluding thoughts: Romantic disability studies has much work to do to recover disability history on the stage and on the page. Holcroft's Deaf and Dumb is a culturally significant play that raised awareness about deaf education. It presents sign language both as an integral part of intellectual inquiry and as an important humanitarian cause. There are many avenues for this research to take. Examining the lost cultures of disability and disabled experiences will establish the important place of disability in the context of shifting attitudes towards the art and craft of the theatrical world. In general, I hope this project contributes to the wider scholarly focus on relocating disability from the margins, an important aspect of disability justice. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There are some questions that are popping up in the chat. So we're going to have a look at that once all the speakers have spoken. And so we are tracing a very interesting, charting a very interesting territory. And I have noticed that so far, nobody has mentioned the big word Coleridge, for instance. No big word like, oh, there was one mention about somebody mentioned Byron earlier on. No Wordsworth, no big names, a lot of little unknown images as well. So it gives us an idea that theatre studies are still very much a growing field, a developing field. So we are moving on to the fourth speaker of the day. So from the theatre of characters, which was the topic of the second presentation, we're going to move onto a theatre of economics. And our fourth speaker for the session is David, who is going to talk about theatronomics. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Fran. Can you see my slides?
I can.
Yeah,
Thank
great, fantastic. So thanks very much, Fran, for organising this, and many thanks to the BARS digital team for facilitating us this evening. So really what I'm going to do is give a very brief overview to this project. So the project identifies the rich financial archives for Covent Garden and Drury Lane theatres in the British and Folger libraries as key underused sources for understanding the 18th century history of cultural production. These very substantial archives are comprised of a considerable run of account books, journals and ledgers for the period that give very specific detail on revenues, ticket sales, salary, other costs, and audience profiles, details that offer a way of telling the story of 18th century theatre as one of commercial competition, and to think more about how finance allows or constrains cultural production. So our opening position is that the excellent scholarship on Georgian theatre to date has one significant gap, and that's the underuse of this detailed financial archive. There has been some work done, notably by Judith Millhouse and Robert Hume, but it has been limited in nature, as the archive is, to use Millhouse's term, intimidating. The material is voluminous, diffuse, and the data is irregular and difficult to interpret, not to mention full of gaps and inconsistencies. So you really do need, I think, a big project-based approach to tackle these manuscripts. This is what it looks like. I mean, they vary considerably, but this might be a typical page. So receipts on one side, on the left-hand side there, and various outgoings then on the right. And this again from the same season. This is what a payday might look like. So you can see there's lots of very detailed information there. And some samples of it appear in the London Stage, but there's quite a lot of it that doesn't. So here's a kind of overview of 3 seasons that I have done. This is part of the application. And you can see, even with this basic data, we can make some useful observations. We can see that Covent Garden generated more revenue from fewer performances over this period, fewer performances and with a lower capacity. This suggests that Covent Garden was being managed more efficiently than Drury Lane. But we don't currently know or have the means to figure out more precisely the reasons for this. Was it down to actor salary costs? Was it down to fuller theatres? Was it to do with the quality of productions or the celebrity of the playwright or actors in question? Were there any exceptional costs that arose in the period for Drury Lane? So we can see that Covent Garden's profit margin dipped considerably in 82-83 due to the expansion and refurbishment of the theatre. But this is an exceptional once-off cost, so one could argue quite reasonably that this cost should be capitalized and depreciated over a to be determined period to assess the commercial soundness of this decision. And even if we allow for the exceptional nature of Covent Garden's costs in 82-83, this theatre seems to have a steadier rein on its costs compared to Drury Lane, where costs jumped considerably over the 3 seasons. We can see that Drury Lane is generating more revenue per seat than Covent Garden in 82-83, but also that its profit margin is considerably lower. But we need more data and a more sophisticated analysis than I can do to create a sustainable and statistically robust measure of commercial performance across the century. We would need, for starters, a detailed breakdown of costs and a breakdown of personnel, and we need to account for inflation and develop a set of financial performance metrics. So you can see there that I have a metric there of average revenue per seat, but I think one could argue against that. I mean, is this really a suitable metric when we have, 8 different price points for entry to a theatre on any given night? And most importantly, we need a much bigger sample of seasons to put this into context. So broadly speaking, the project has 4 main areas of interest. So one is the acting career, one is thinking about the financial value of particular plays and playwrights to the theatre, one is thinking about audience profiles, and finally theatres in the local economy. I'm only going to say a little bit about the first 2 today. So on actors then, there's been a very rich vein of work on the emergence of celebrity and its mediation in the Romantic period. While this work has certainly enriched our understanding of theatre, one could argue that the emphasis on celebrity culture has meant that the experiences and lives of less illustrious jobbing actors have been sidelined. The acting companies of Covent Garden and Drury Lane were substantial. Both had about 80 actors employed in the 81-82 season, for instance. And the London Stage, which is, as I'm sure we all know on this call, an 11-volume theatrical calendar for the period. So this lists their names, their weekly salaries were available, and the first and last date of their performance in a season. This level of detail allows us, with some effort, to trace the career of an actor over the seasons. So the ambition is for this project to allow scholars to view profiles of a range of actors and their aggregated activities, the theatres with which they are associated, their plays and their earnings over time. And it will try and develop models to answer questions of productivity and efficiency. So we can see here that in 82-83, Covent Garden paid Charles Macklin £31 10 shillings per night, paid Lewis £9.15 per week, and Francis Abington got £600 for the season. So we need to think about ways to compare these. On the face of it, Macklin looks like he's got the best deal, but we would need to look at how many performances each participated in and the associated revenues with those performances to determine who represented the best value to the theatre. Like, which of these represents a wily and strategic appointment in terms of the theatre manager. And we'd need to see this season in the context of the overall career. So at this point, whose was waxing and whose was waning. We want to develop a comparative model where we can map salaries onto performances and revenues to determine the productivity and financial value of the actors over time, value to the theatres. Other questions will pop up, such as how important is gender or marital status, for instance, to financial remuneration? How do benefit nights feed into and connect with salary negotiations? And so we're going to pay particular attention to the life cycle of the actor, to think about how a typical career begins and how it might end. So I'll say a little something about plays then and playwrights. So the project will pay attention to the complex financial interdependence of the main piece and the after piece. So in an economist terms, the main piece and after piece betray characteristics both of complementary goods, so that is goods that tend to be purchased together and have what's known as a negative cross elasticity of demand. So as the price of one goes up, the demand for the other goes down. But also characteristics of substitute goods. So consumers buy one or the other. So that's the opposite, a positive cross elasticity of demand. The price of one goes up, the demand for the other one goes up as they substitute. So in our context, some theatre attendees will go to see the main piece and see the after piece as a consequence of it deciding to go to the theatre that evening. So that's a complementary relationship. But others will see the after piece only, perhaps because it's all they can afford. And of course, they'll also see part of the main piece, you know, as part of that decision to go see the afterpiece. So ultimately, you know, we will generate enough data so that the theatre historian will be able to determine whether the £184 total taken in by Covent Garden for Richard Cumberland's main piece, The Wheel of Fortune, and George Coleman's afterpiece, Bluebeard, represents commercial success or not for a Friday night in November 1799. And crucially, how we might allocate those revenues between those two plays in order to understand the relative importance of those plays and playwrights to Covent Garden, and of course also to determine how this changes over time. So what's clear is, I think, even from this quick examples, that assessing whether the financial performance of any given play or playwright is a complex task and involves many variables and assumptions. Regression analysis, that is statistical modeling that measures the effect of independent variables on a dependent variable, is required at a minimum to make sense of this complex picture. Analyzing theatrical revenues, that is our dependent variable, would require taking account of the host of independent variables. So what day of the week is a play staged on, in what months? Because if you look at it, particular months are more, are on average show higher revenues than others, and same with the days. You know, other independent variables, author, theatre, afterpiece, actors, and so on. So such analysis would also perhaps require consideration of the weather, crime, competing theatrical productions, or other entertainment events such as pleasure gardens and so on. There's fascinating financial data on the various expenditures of the theatres on music, scenography, and advertising, all of which would need to be considered. And inferential statistics may be able to help us to fill the gaps in data to get a fuller picture. So there's quite a lot of data available, but there are also, as one might imagine, considerable gaps, so seasons missing and so on. So kind of these kinds of approaches and tools, regression analysis, inferential statistics, and so on, we're not trained to carry out these kinds of econometric analysis to do this in a meaningful way. But I think they are essential to ensure that such analysis satisfies you know, that the statistics we might produce are rigorous. But also, even though we're not trained to do it, we are, you know, best placed as theatre historians to guide econometric analysis as to the relative importance of these variables to cultural history. And at the same time, econometric analysis can tell us how, you know, how these numbers might challenge our current thinking in the field. By way of conclusion, I'll simply say econometric analysis does not provide all the answers. I'm certainly not going to make that claim. It can be read, I think, or could be read as a somewhat reductive approach that erases the social assemblage, to use David Worrell's term, that constitutes the world of Romantic theatre. I make no claims that econometric analysis can solve theatre history, but it's surely uncontested that it would bring a much richer wealth of detail to the debate. Theatre historians, you know, as Helen was talking about in her paper, have long been, you know, fixated by and bemoaned the difficulty of capturing the essence of theatrical performance, lost inevitable due to the transience of the form. Crucially, if perhaps counterintuitively, the sort of rigorous analysis proposed here that incorporates big data statistics around actors, backstage staff, theatre size, genre, and the historical moment has the potential to bring us even closer to the in-the-moment ephemerality of Romantic theatrical performance. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. That was absolutely fascinating. I think a few questions have cropped up. We're going to have a look at them at the end. And I think it's my turn now. And after a story of success, a story of dismal failure. Let's see if I can open my presentation. That's that. Okay. Right, I hope this is gonna work. Okay. So my project is about one specific author, an author who is better known as a very famous novelist and a little bit less as a playwright. Absolutely many people are not even aware that she was a dramatist as well, in the sense of writing tragedies and historical dramas. So the now substantial bibliography of critical studies devoted to the work of Frances Burney has confirmed the stature as an author, but it has mostly focused on her novels and journals, leaving one area of her work almost untouched: the dramatic works in various stages of completion that Burney wrote during the years she spent at the court of George III. As we know all too well, those were momentous years which marked the start of a decennium mirabilis for English literature. Heady and factional at the same time, astride impending economic recession, political turmoil, and war with the new French Republic, this was a crucial decade in many respects. And it is no accident that it has always captured the attention of critics, whether they have been drawn to the early novel of Austen or the treatises of authors such as Burke, Wollstonecraft, and Payne. By the 1790s, Burney had already amassed substantial cultural and celebrity capital. Her debut novel, Evelina, had achieved indisputable success. Her next novel, Cecilia, had confirmed that she was no one-hit wonder and had made her the best-selling female author of the 1780s. But now her new situation at court, with its flexible schedule and burdensome royal ceremonial, had produced a state of prostration aggravated by the distressing mental illness of the king. It is precisely from 1788 that Burney's diaries record the composition of a small number of playtexts which remained in manuscript until 1995. These are the dramatic fragment, conventionally known as Alberta, and 3 finished plays copied out in beautiful handwriting in ordered booklets. The long-delayed publication of these plays has kept critics away, apart from very few. Even for the handful of scholars who have dealt with them, these texts remain devoid of real dramatic qualities, whatever we mean with the expression dramatic qualities. Indeed, wretched as they are often called. They seem too long to be staged, characterizations are stereotyped, the endings are weak, and the plots convoluted and inconsistent. The style, rhetorical and emphatic, makes them some clumsy and heavy to the modern ear. As my project Opera New will prove, the quartet of tragedies that Burney wrote during her period at court, a time marked by the incapacitating illness of the king and the consequent political crisis, but also by Britain's recent loss of the American colonies, prompts our critical thinking in terms of such present-day practices and policies as gender relations, body politics, agency. The plays raise many provocative questions for both the critic and the thespian, and our current complex juncture seems an especially apt moment to grant them a long overdue audience as well as a stage. Burney herself must have had very clear ideas about the potential of these works. In 1794, after her marriage to Alexandre d'Arblay, a French émigré, and several months pregnant as she was, she must have realized that the economic needs of a new family made it imperative that she find a secure and immediate source of income. And it was on these obscure manuscripts that Burney pinned her hopes. At first, she gave a copy of Hubert de Vere to Richard Sheridan, the playwright, who was also the owner of Drury Lane, and Sheridan responded positively to staging it. However, Burney chose to withdraw this work in favor of a second, more markedly historical play, Edwin Elgiva, which was in fact staged, although for one night only, on the 21st of March, 1795, garnering unanimous negative reviews from the public and the critics. As Charles Burney wrote to his sister, praising her stoic acceptance of the universal criticism received by Edwin, I honor your heroism. I always feared pelting. The third play in the group, The Siege of Penancey, also addresses historical topics popular at the time. A quick check of the Larpent catalogues online reveals, for example, the presence throughout the century of plays with siege in the title. You have an example in the following slide. The Siege of Belgrade, which premiered at Haymarket in 1792 and was printed in 1798. So Burney wasn't really far off the mark, wide off the mark. Of the fourth play, Alberta, we have only scattered fragments, which makes it difficult to identify a clear plot. Its declamatory and emphatic style, punctuated by such coded lexemes as storm, passion, wildness, and reliant on the magniloquence of the blank verse, typical of Burney's dramas, also suggests an explicit affiliation with Gothic drama, the genre that was reaping successes on both licensed and unlicensed stages. When properly contextualized and studied as theatrical texts rather than as unfortunate second-order productions among the labors of a successful novelist, the four court plays, as my contention, suggest a distinct thematic, stylistic, discursive alignment, more in line with the dramatic production of the late 18th century that has been recognized thus far. Acutely conscious of the urgency of earning enough to support her growing family and driven by remarkable commercial savviness, Burney identified the stage as the route to financial independence. However, as a woman, her position of enunciation to claim theatrical agency was comparatively low. After a few short days after the stage failure of Edwy, she became aware that trying to convert her celebrity capital into stage cultural capital to gain the respect of those holding sway over theatrical judgment was going to be a very difficult task indeed. Only 4 months after the deeply felt failure of Edwy, and after much thought, Burney agreed to publish by subscription the novel she had already been working on prior to Edwy. Camilla came out in 1796, and its subscription list attests, yet again, Burney's ability to manage for economic purposes her cultural and institutional capital in a field apparently more acceptable for her, if not to her, the novel. As you see in the slide, she talks about herself as resources that have always been considered as such by others. Nonetheless, Edwin Elgiva continued to move in and out of Burney's drawer over the years, along with the other plays which Burney never succeeded in bringing to the stage, but on which she continued to work regularly until late in life, as shown by some loose sheets from an 1814 calendar on which she scribbled some revisions to Alberta. As Burney wrote to her father, who unremittingly smothered her thespian ambitions and basically until he died, I am not at all without thoughts of a future revise of Edwin Elgiva, for which I formed a plan on the first night. Opera New, my project, embraces the call to look beyond Romanticism as well as, I would argue, around Romanticism, around its often prevailing and often narrowly literary productions and around text-based methods of inquiry. I aim to restore to Burney's small dramatic corpus the cultural depth that has been lost over time owing to a masculinist conception of the theatrical form and therefore the construction of a canon that depreciated women's presence and built a high narrative of Romanticism. Crucially, this is my point, reviving plays that were not commercially viable also establishes a different economic narrative of Romantic dramaturgy, moving back to the first stage, those contemporary stage hybrids that baffle canonical taxonomies of form, genre, and code. Finally, the semi-historical discourse of the stage crucially allowed Burney to dramatize the politics of her day in a way she had been unable to do in her first two novels, and to question, as much as other contemporary playwrights did, the long-standing construction of theater as a reliable instrument of social control. Burney's speaking bodies, particularly the female ones, unmask and debunk the fraught relationship of the individual with social and state apparatuses, social forces and techniques of disciplining whose oppression become dangerously naturalized. Despite living through a far from homogeneous historical and literary period, Burney is considered an 18th century author because of the publication date of her first two novels. Repositioning Burney, the dramatist, in the Romantic context is therefore a significant broadening and completion of the canon, or rather the repertoire, as per the etymology of the word, reportare. By using digital methods alongside literary analysis, I construct an expanding multimedia ecology for Burney's unstaged plays, a capacious mediascape that aspire to reproduce, through contemporary tools and channels of communication, the Romantic theatre experience, which was inherently immersive, multimedia, interactive. The variety of media deployed by the project is itself instructive, as in the long 18th century, non-performative media and performative representations were dynamically and mutually constituted beyond the performance print divide enforced by later critics and historians. Therefore, as a way of rounding up the whole seminar and my presentation as well, looking back on today's wonderful presentations, it becomes clear that Romantic theatre and theatre at large is good to think with. I'm quoting from Claude Lévi-Strauss's sentence, especially in moments of social stress and trauma. Now as never before can historical and political theatre help audiences, which means help us, to reconsider the present through the past. The struggles between body politic, bodies public, as well as pressing issues such as power, identity, rhetoric, and representation. Therefore, fulfilling the social imperatives of a publicly funded research project, and ideally rebuilding and reconceptualizing the relationships between the skene, the stage and the actor on the one hand, and the koilon, the auditorium and the public on the other. Theatre helps to interpret the elements of culture, the very seeds of humanism. By allowing a more public, open ownership of science, new media provide the means to sow and to grow those seeds in new environments and for new audiences. Thank you. Okay, so thank you very much. This brings us to the end of the seminar, and now I see that there is quite a long list of questions, and the instructions are that you can unmute and speak your questions, or we can go through them by having a look at the chat, whichever. I don't know if Mad or Anna, Francesca, do you have any preferences? So we unmute and speak our questions, or should we have half and half, maybe a spoken question and a chat question? What do you think? Yeah, I don't hear anybody.
Can maybe ask the person who contributed the question what they would prefer?
Yes, can actually do so. And if somebody has not asked a question in the chat, are still able to participate in conversation just by raising their hands, and let me see. Right, so there we go. Question. I think that is a question for Asaka, because I take David meant D&D for deaf and dumb. David, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. Yeah, no, I was just curious about whether Asaka had found a relationship between that particular play and charitable benefits in her research, and whether we see similar. I was quite struck by the number of plays with Dumb in the title, and it was a sample that I think you said, Asaka. So it was very surprising to me, incredibly interesting. And so I was just curious about whether we see similar numbers for blind and deaf, or indeed any other kinds of disabilities in the period.
Thanks for the question, David. Yes, the newspaper archive is quite good on deaf and dumb. So the Edinburgh newspapers and the Birmingham newspapers announce and review the play, and also can make connections with the deaf establishment. Edinburgh was important as one of the earliest, it was the earliest place in Britain which had a deaf school. So it was remarked that the play was on because of that. But in the case of Birmingham, the Duke of Devonshire was at that performance and was the patron of the deaf school that just recently been established there. And they give the figures of how much money he gave on that night, on the opening night of that play. And it was explicitly a fundraiser performance of it. What's fascinating is when you get to America, there are also, well, the preface to the 1818 edition makes it very clear that there are economic reasons for republishing that play in America, as well as awareness raising reasons as well. And the money is going into the deaf school, the first deaf school in America. So yes, the answer is there are clear connections. I haven't investigated the background of the other dumb plays to see whether they are specifically connected with other institutions. What's fascinating about the deaf and dumb story is that there is a good amount of material out there about this causing, this play, Holcroft's version of it, causing people to go eventually, once the war quietened down, to France to go and look at the deaf school there. So it was kind of a tourist attraction it became, and they would also donate when they went there too. So yeah, there's quite a lot of economic activity around this play in terms of going into money going into deaf education as a result of it. With the answer to the other question about blindness, there is surprisingly much less of it. I am not entirely sure why. My best guess is maybe safety. You know, I've actually been involved in a play with a blind character in it who fell off the stage, and so it may well be that. But it's, I mean, we do have lots of cases, obviously, you know, in the canon where characters are blinded in the stories, but in terms of the titles, there are very few that I've come across so far with blindness in the title.
Thanks very much. That's really interesting. I as this project, I mean, my project is only really getting going, but benefit nights seem to be one of the really interesting things that are really fascinating to dig into the detail. To think not just about how, you know, how actors manage to negotiate them and the relationship between that and their salary, but also is a relationship between, you know, how well a theatre does in a particular season and the amount of charitable benefit nights it allocates. Then what is it that gets a charitable cause a benefit night over some other equally worthy cause? There's huge amounts of work, I think, that could be done on benefit nights. So that was kind of where the question came from. So thanks a million.
Yeah, thank you. I clocked that when you said that. It's actually really interesting to see how much is being funneled into charitable purposes more generally, rather than just, you know, reading about the squabbles in actor memoirs about who's getting the benefit night where and which nights they're getting, which is obviously quite a competitive thing. One other way in which actually, which I just want a question for you really quickly while I've got you. One thing that came up for me was this idea of box office fever. And box office fever is a way of describing when actors looked at the takings, the ticket sales, and decided they'd go sick in order so they didn't have to perform to a small theatre audience. And so it became box office fever, like, you know, it didn't matter what they had, it was just called that, as a way to describe the illness, in inverted commas, that they supposedly have. And that apparently drove this idea of certification of actor illnesses. And so people started publicizing in the papers and putting up on notices what exactly was wrong with them in detail, rather than they were just, you know, drunk or just there was, you know, not very many people that bought a ticket, therefore we cancelled it. So I'll be interested to see if you've got box office fever.
That's incredibly fascinating. It's really, I mean, it's really interesting. I mean, I haven't really come across that term before, but, you know, often, you know, you do see actors coming out and apologizing and explaining their absences. So you're talking this early 19th century?
I'm talking, yes, absolutely, yeah.
Oh, that's great, thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, there are quite a few questions for David. So first of all, I see that there's Sarah McCleave. You want to speak your question, Sarah?
Sure, David, it sort of revealed itself later, but because you were using language such as actors and playwrights, I was wondering the extent to which musicians and dancers and their contribution to the theatre economy was going to feature in your project.
Yeah, no, thanks, Sarah. Thanks for that question. As much as possible, I think. So I guess the answer to that is we're really interested in drilling down into the amount of money that's spent on dancers, on particular musical instruments. You know, kettle drums is one that crops up quite a bit, and that's of huge importance to the project. Whether we can then associate those revenues with particular individuals, I think, is something I'd be much more hesitant about promising. But you know, singing and dancing, thinking about what proportion of cost they represent, and again how that changes over time, I think will help us bring a degree of granular detail to, I guess, you know, truisms that we take in the field, such as the rise of spectacle and so on. I mean, one would expect to see the proportion of money spent on scenography and on music to rise, well, over particularly, say, the Romantic period. So it'll be interesting to see the degree to which the numbers corroborate that.
Thank you.
I think there is also a question from Gillian. Still another question for David. Gillian, are you here? If not, I can read it. Is there an equivalent of an agent negotiating for an actor, David? Or do family members do that?
We haven't come across that yet. I mean, I think it's fair to say, hi, Gillian. I think it's fair to say that the stage of the project we're at is quite early. So what we're currently doing is trying to construct and scheme out the way the database will be will operate. So in terms of the primary research, you know, we're really kind of looking at the account books to get a sense of them and how they vary, and you know, what's recorded, what's not recorded, how that changes between theatre and between period. So the answer is I can't answer that fully yet. I mean, my own sense of that is, I mean, I haven't come across that. You know, usually we'll see, you know, family members, as you say, or even, you know, actors or playwrights saying, well, I heard you gave this amount of money to Johnny, so why am I getting the same kind of money as that? You know, in fact, the project stems from, I think, finding a letter from Charles Macklin to Fleetwood saying that, you know, if you look at your account books, you'll see that I bring in more money than Mrs. Pritchard and can't remember the other actor. You know, so you should be giving me this amount, and if you give me this contract, you know, I will guarantee £180 a night to the theatre, and I'll just take whatever. So he's kind of trying to guarantee. So that just brought up all sorts of questions to me about, well, you know, how could he prove this? How would you think about demonstrating this by looking at account books? And can account books give us the answers to those questions? So I hope I'll give you a better answer next time.
Okay, sure. No, I think I'd just like a Romantic period call my agent. No, but yeah, so.
Well, there'll be enough sex anyway.
Yeah.
Any more questions? I don't see if there are any hands up. If not, I have a question for, oh, Asaka, is it you? You want to ask a question? I'm not sure if, did you raise your hand? No.
No, I'm not hand raised, no.
I was wondering whether I can ask Helen a question. I was quite taken by the last slide, beyond the page and stage slide. Helen, are you there?
Yeah, I am, yeah.
Yes, that was lovely, the two figurines.
Oh,
I was wondering whether you have, obviously, theatrical portraiture and theatrical prints are obviously very, very important. What kind of evidence have you found of those figurines? So theater and actors in material culture, and also possibly in household goods or fashion accessories or something like that. Do you have evidence in terms of going beyond print and stage in that direction?
Yeah. Oh, thank you, Francesca. Yeah, those figurines that I showed are the ones that are best evidence, because there are just so many of them, like a really astounding number actually for something that's so fragile and could so easily have been broken. And there, I just showed 2 examples there, but they come on all different kinds of plinths and stands, and the Kitty Clive one was made by both Bow and Derby, so they were clearly like so popular that people were stealing the designs. And these are like expensive products. They're made in a mold, but the mold's made by artisans, and some of them are painted as well. And in that case, they're shipped out of the factory to be painted. It's like a very expensive process. So these cost a lot of money, and yet it's fairly easy to find them in museum collections, which just suggests how many were made. There's also in I think it's Bayes in the Green Room, sort of parodic poem about the stage, has Henry Woodward talking about how all the ladies like him because they buy his little figurine. These things were so, like, even if people didn't own them, they knew about them enough for that to pop up there. The other kind of, those aren't the only figurines, but there are a lot of them. The other one that's really popular is Richard III in 2 styles. One, a kind of the tent scene that was painted by Hogarth. That's new versions of that in figurine are being made in the 1850s. Like, no one alive could possibly have seen Garrick in that role, but they'll recognize, presumably through the Hogarth painting and just cultural memory, that's persisted as something that people are still buying. Heather McPherson's does an absolutely great article about there's one with like Richard III, like pointing, and with minor alterations you can find versions of it as Garrick, Kemble and Keane. So people are just still buying them throughout the period. They're like really, I wish I could remember who it was. I want to say it was Anna Myers. Someone did a great presentation at a London Stage and Visual Culture conference on how popular Richard III was in this period. Like, people really want to own Richard III products. So he's pretty well represented.
The ownership is really, really interesting. Thank you very much. I see that there is a hand up. Franca, do you want to?
Yes.
Hello, everyone. Welcome.
So hello everyone, Francesca, thank you for, hi everyone. Thanks for organizing this great panel, and thanks everyone. Very briefly, for a question for Helen and one for Asaka, very briefly. For Helen, your focus on the embodied character, I think that brings in a very fascinating theoretical questions on the nature of performance and on the durability, what is left of the actor's art once the performance is over, which is something that Judith Pascoe also discusses in her beautiful book on Saracen and Sodophiles. So I was wondering if you are dealing with these issues, let's say, within the context of your romantic focus, okay? And as for Asaka, I was just wondering, what you make? I mean, if there is any rationale, any sense in this emphasis on location that we find in, I mean, I was just struck, most of the 30 bout plays that you mention are geographically located. So these deaf and dumb girls or boys or orphans or whatever are either in Manchester or in the Tyrol, or in quite a strong emphasis on location. It was just wondering. So thanks everyone.
Asaka, do you want me to jump in first and do them in order? Oh, thanks. Thank you so much for that question. That was such a great question to receive, because I emailed my supervisor about this yesterday. Like, this feels so important. I really do lots with this. Partly because I feel like those like big theoretical questions that like really persist today, like the questions of repetition and liveness, are so important, and theatrical archive. I kind of this is still very being thought through, but I feel like the Romantic period is really where that sort of starts being born. And I think that there's something about this being a period of further mediatization and with enough of a theatrical institution for people to be aware of what's been lost. Like saying about the image of Garrick for people who never saw him, like I think there is something about like this is a real significant moment where people become anxious that they're going to lose what they're seeing on stage. So I definitely think that's important, and I think there's something really interesting historically about that.
Okay, great, thanks.
Hi, thanks for your question. It's really interesting, isn't it? The why are there so many places in the titles? I would hazard a guess that they have the sets for those things, because they're often quite elaborate ones. So the Avignon one is interesting, Toulon, Genoa. I would suspect they're reusing sets, and this is probably an economic situation that people are writing for specific theatres, knowing exactly what tools they have. There's an interesting one that the Deaf and Dumb by Holcroft is set in Toulouse, and there are some letters where Anne Plumtree, the novelist, goes on a journey to Toulouse, having seen Holcroft's play, in order to go and see it because she saw the set and wanted to know if it was as nice in real life as it was in the play. And then she meets somebody on the way in the carriage that she's sharing, some other tourist who, and they have a conversation about whether the story about Julio and Theodore is real. And have a disagreement about whether it's real or not. So you know, she carries that, and she pops into the Paris school as well on her journey as well. So there's some interesting kind of connections with place in the fact that people are consuming these performances and actually going to the places because they've seen the set. But I should imagine it's a way of cultural tourism. You know, people know they're recognisable places. Manchester, I have less kind of. Why Manchester?
Exactly, I was just wondering.
I don't know why Manchester.
Okay.
The Venice of the North or something like that. I don't know. But thanks for the question. It is quite striking, isn't it? Yeah. Good to see you again as well, by the way.
Grazie. Same with you. Yeah.
I think there are another couple of questions. I wonder if we still have time to squeeze the last couple of questions in. What do you think? Organizers, there's one question for Sarah, for instance. James, you want to ask Sarah a question?
Sure. I think I'm freezing there. Okay. I was just wondering if we saw any increase or decrease over the period of the actresses wanting to play these roles. And I'm thinking in particular of Sarah Siddons sort of getting into trouble when she was taking fencing lessons, because then you had all these rumors. So what did the actresses think it's desirable to go on stage bearing arms, or was there a bit of a danger if I go on and I'm bearing arms? Is that going to ruin my reputation?
Yeah, thank you. That's such a good question, and I think probably the best example of danger surrounding arms bearing actresses that comes to mind is that of Fanny Kelly, who I mentioned at the end of my presentation today. So quite famously, Kelly was stalked ultimately by a man called George Barnett, who actually turned up at the theatre, I think it was Drury Lane, in 1816, and tried to shoot Fanny Kelly because he disapproved of the roles, predominantly the cross-dressed roles that she was performing on stage. But this is just a year, of course, or 6 months really, after she had performed the role of Leontina, the cannon-firing heroine in Charles the Bold. And you know, she was renowned for those type of Amazonian performances. And he actually wrote he was obsessed with her, you know, he was writing love letters to her, and he wrote in the final love letter before the attempted assassination of Fanny Kelly that he loved her so much, and yet she was letting herself down by performing those types of roles on stage. So there's absolutely dangers for the actress who performs these type of roles. But I think in terms of the popularity of the Amazon, particularly among actresses themselves, the melodrama is a really focal genre to hone in on. There are actresses, again, the one that comes to mind in this case is Sarah Egerton, who had been a failed tragic actress. You know, she was, all the reviews that she had received from performing in Shakespearean roles and other legitimate dramas had been really negative. You have reviewers saying, oh, you know, she's not Siddons-esque, you know, she's not cut out for this type of role. But she actually rises to fame in melodramatic adaptations, mostly of Sir Walter Scott's novels. So she's in The Heart of Midlothian, and she's in Rob Roy McGregor as well. And she actually, I think she plays Ravina in The Miller and His Men, you know, so again, you know, the sort of explosive firing heroine. So for Sarah Egerton, there's something really desirable about these types of roles in the melodramatic genre specifically, because for whatever reason, it grants her this opportunity to perform to strengths that she has in those roles as they are performed in melodrama, but you know, in a sort of separate vein to how they're performed in tragedy. And I think that, you know, there's a degree of respectability around the kind of Siddons-esque tragic heroine, you know, Lady Macbeth, epitomising that you don't get in melodrama. So it does open up opportunities for slightly lesser actresses to rise to fame in those Amazonian roles that become so ubiquitous in melodramas, particularly, I'd say, between sort of 1805 to around 1820. I mean, you have sort of Camilla the Amazon, you know, Jane Scott's play, of course. Matthew G. Lewis also writes Timur the Tartar, which features Zorilda, who's like an Amazonian princess. And I think it's around 1822 or possibly 1821, you also get a melodramatic play about Joan of Arc by Edward Fitzball. So I think the Amazon, in terms of her popularity on stage, really enjoys a heyday in melodramas of the, you know, from about 1805 to 1820. And this is kind of the second project which I really want to work on, because it does just seem that there is that period where she really does become this popular figure, but at the same time performing that role is wrought with dangers, as the example of Fanny Kelly I think really brilliantly illustrates. So yes, thank you so much for your question.
Well, I think I'm afraid the time is up. There may be still question in the chat I haven't been able to see. I'm asking for assistance here. I think we're 6 minutes past finishing time. So Matt, Anna, Francesca, I don't know, I think.
I can just appear. I had a question, but I deleted it, realizing that we were running low on time. But thanks for all these really brilliant presentations. Okay, can we have another round of applause for everyone who's spoken today? It's been a really rich and full and interesting session on romantic theatre, showing that the state of the field is healthy. There are many exciting things in progress at the moment. If it's all right, I will just plug our next two events in the chat. Francesca has jumped in as well with those. But because we had an event postponed during the strikes, the next BARS digital event is next Thursday at 5 o'clock. That's Radical Connections, a digital show and tell. And then the sort of second half of our romantic theatre double bill is in a month's time. So we have this event on the state of the field, and we have an event on the visual life of romantic theatre on the 19th of May, again at 5 o'clock in the evening. So please do come along to those if you are interested. And hopefully we'll be able to pick up some of the really interesting threads that our speakers and our questions today have raised. But thank you all so much for coming along, and thanks in particular to our speakers for their fascinating papers.
Thank you, everybody. Virtual glass. We're raising a virtual glass to BARS and to all the speakers. See you soon.
Thank you so much.